right, so with that underway, what our goal is today is to really talk about what has become more of a pressing concern over this return to train, return to play, and return to compete. So we're going to touch on a few of those things, but prior to doing that, I just want to really outline, look, everything we do as coaches, we don't do anything individually, all right? It's a collaborative effort, and we all have peers, we all have mentors that we work with, and obviously, you know, I strongly encourage you to continue to do that even, you know, through these challenging times that we have. As we move into the presentation, what I do want to let you know is what the presentation is not. So the presentation is not about COVID-19. All right, I'm sure you can find a plethora of information around COVID-19, some of the regulations from the governing bodies around social distancing, appropriate COVID hygiene, and the like. So the presentation has nothing to do with that. But what the presentation does have to do with is how we're going to structure our return to training, our return to play, and then our return to competition. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. First off, I'm currently working with Basketball New Zealand with some of their programs. So we're going to go through some of the structures that we've put in place in relation to return to training across a very condensed schedule. And that is a 5-week lead-in to obviously players heading back into the New Zealand NBL, and touch on a few of the areas around that 5-week preparation. And we'll spend some time going into some detail just around how we're looking at structuring that. And that may be useful when you're considering how you'll structure your use of time to prepare your players moving forward. With that in mind, obviously there's key policies out there, and I strongly recommend everyone look at some of the key policies that you can find, and you can find these online without too much trouble. The first one, the Australian Institute of Sport Framework for Rebooting Sport in the COVID-19 environment. We're going to touch on that very briefly because there's a very nice flowchart in there that articulates very well a process as we move back into the environment. Some of our structuring in relation to the program design and the principles come from the COVID-19 Return to Training, a guideline set by the National Strength and Conditioning Association. So we'll touch on that briefly. And then that has led to obviously the framework for Basketball New Zealand with their COVID-19 Return to Training and Competition policy document that we've just recently released. So to start the ball moving, so to speak, if we look at the AIS framework, what this framework does allow for us is it shows us a specific pathway in that if an athlete or a member has not experienced COVID in the last 14 days, and it gives you a framework to follow what to do if they have not, what to do if they have, and how you can sort of structure your referral network and what you need to do in order to look after, one, first and foremost yourself, and two, everybody else around you. So the framework from the AIS really does provide a good structure to do that in relation to the assessment of athletes and staff prior to resumption of formal training. So I recommend you jump onto the AIS website and have a look at that particular document. The second one, very briefly, the COVID-19 Return to Training guidelines by the National Strength and Conditioning Association. It goes through predominantly how we're going to restructure conditioning to have athletes obtain a level of fitness as we move them back into more of a competitive environment. And then for the guidelines today, we're really going to look at the consensus statement on transitions and periods of time as we move back into a safe return to training. Although this paper deals with injury, there's a specific framework in there that we've used successfully, and we're going to apply that to what we do in relation to our return to training guidelines. And then finally, that brings us to the Basketball New Zealand guidelines themselves, where we really looked at what we can do to structure training to ensure a safe return, not only to training, but to play and to competition. Obviously, we know our competition demands are the highest in having impact on load for our athletes. So how do we then prepare them in relation to return to train? And prior to that, obviously return to train. So train, play, and then competition. Now, you're probably aware of this one. It's been floating around social media for a little while. And it was really around the issues for following quarantine and what we can learn from previous issues related to different sports. And this example is from the National Football League. And what they looked at here really was issues surrounding a period where there was a very condensed preparation period. In surveying the NFL over a period of time, Dr. Greg Meyer and his colleagues looked at the number of Achilles tendon ruptures that occurred pretty much over an 8-year period. And as you can see, the prevalence in relation to the number of tendon ruptures themselves were fairly low, around 5 per year across that 7-8 year period. However, there was a lockout for the NFL, which resulted in a significantly reduced time period for preparation for play. And as you can see, when they go through this period where there was the lockout, within a 1-month period following retraining or going back into the preseason after the extended 4-month lockout, you can see there was a significant increase in the number of ruptures. So 12 ruptures within a month, but most strikingly, there were 10 ruptures occurred over the first 12 days. So a significant increase in injury rates as they've gone from a lockout period back into return to play, return to compete. So this is of significant concern, especially we go into all of our court sports where we have a high degree of eccentric loading and braking going through the body, along with rapid changes of direction. Add to that some contact. We need to ensure that we develop our athletes' armour to cope with those demands. But really, when we look at the overall process and what it did say in relation to moving forward, there were 3 key recommendations. And they were that a progressive pre-season targeting neuromuscular training and conditioning is paramount. So we need to look at neuromuscular activities such as balance and postural stability type movements, balancing on one leg, doing some single leg arabesque, knee to chest, right? Doing some jump landing with perturbations and slight contact prior to landing. Ways that we can really look at integrating some neuromuscular training within your warm-up is an appropriate place to do that. Obviously, we need to have access to sports medicine professionals and qualified strength and conditioning staff to assist with the integration to training. And then, as they mentioned, there's a dose response to look at a positive change in relation to an injury prevention strategy of around 6 to 8 weeks. So collectively, when we look at all that, we need to look at how we're going to target our return to train before we then progress our athletes to return to play and then ultimately return to competition. But I'd like to pose a question before we get going. The first question when we start to review our programs with our athletes really deals with evaluating their quarantine work. So what have they done that's been good in relation to their training in quarantine? So we would hope they've continued some general strength work, and predominantly the assumption would be they've been doing some type of body weight work, some general endurance, so they may have been able to do some running work for their conditioning, and they may have had the opportunity to work on some individual issues around rehabilitation or prehab that they may have had. So that's what we're hoping our athletes have been doing. So moving forward though, the key question for us is, if that's what they've been doing currently, then what is missing? What are the key areas as coaches now transitioning our athletes back into return to train are the key areas that are missing that we need to address? So with that in mind, the first question I want to pose before we break off into our first breakout room is what's missing? So as your athletes are returning back to the training environment, what is missing and what do you need to know? All right, so as we just move forward in looking at what is currently missing and what we need to know moving forward with our athletes. So if we move back to that particular example, we discussed some areas around general strength, general endurance, and obviously individual work-ons. But really what is missing as we move from back in the return to train to return to play are the key areas around maximal strength. All right, that's one area that we really need to look at. Obviously specific endurance, and then in relation to all court sports, the levels of change of direction, eccentric loading, so jump training, and then potentially some contact. So we know that they're 3 areas that we would look at structuring into the program as we move forward. So that takes us then to planning. So what are we going to do to plan the program as we go through? And really, there are 4 key principles with any prescription of any program that we need to look at. So really our volume. So I want you to consider, how are you going to determine volume for your athletes? So it could be something as simple as minutes, it may be distance, could be repetitions, maybe jumps. So have a look at what you're going to do in relation to the volume and trying to put a number on how much they're actually doing. And then on the flip side of volume is obviously intensity. So we usually gauge just high, moderate and low. And we will use some type of rating of perceived exertion or an RPE scale to quantify how hard the athlete is actually telling us that particular drill or that particular session was. Frequency is obviously a main domain of those principles. So how often, and we're going to look at the number of sessions per day and per week. That moves into then the competition schedule, so the games, and then collectively, those 2 areas with our sessions per day, sessions per week, and then the game schedule will make up our work density. So how much load is going through the athlete over the period of that week. And then obviously for us, we need to look at some type of game-like simulation. So therefore, we would look at including some type of contact. But once again, we'd be cautious in relation to whether it's more force absorption type contact, so as I'm landing from jumps, or whether it's blunt force trauma. So in a basketball setting, if I'm setting screens or doing post-ups where I'm having direct collisions, I may need to integrate some of that back into my training program. There are some special considerations though if we move to the next area, which is really around load, athlete tolerance themselves. We need to look at some type of strength work for the athlete. We need to ensure that we have a strength base, and we need to look at some of the specific strength characteristics that are indicative of sport. So obviously maximum strength, I said, is one of the key characteristics that we look at. And then we may move into some, if we want to use the term explosive strength, for example. And then have a look at the repeat loading pattern itself. So if they're an athlete that is involved in a court sport activity, that are doing a lot of landing or a lot of jumping, I need to make sure that their structures are strong enough to cope with that loading. So I might need to look at what happens if I do a jump and I land. What happens to the landing mechanics? What happens at the ankle? What happens at the knee? What then happens at the hip? Because generally speaking, we know that the weakest link within the chain is often the one that's going to break. So I need to see what happens with their landing mechanics. Can they absorb that load through the loading pattern itself? Conditioning. So obviously we want to look at how do they move across the field or across the court? What are their running mechanics? And we know that with that, the running and conditioning side of prescription for training, the drill selection is going to have an issue on how hard it is and what the desired outcome will be. And the number of accelerations and decelerations ultimately will also affect the intensity of the activity in relation to conditioning. So I'd have a look at those as I'm programming. And extensively we've used, so some of the work from Jesse Green in particular at Sacramento Kings, with how he describes his programming. He does a really good job of looking at intensive drills versus extensive drills in relation to prescription. And he uses the analogy of intensity, or the intensive work is really competitive, from a basketball perspective, half court type drills, lots of high decelerations, very short intervals, high levels of changes of directions. And then alternatively, the extensive work is more full court, more specific to game related play, longer intervals. You may induce from a conditioning point of view, some fartlek-like training where I have some speed play going there, some walk, jog, run, sprint, jog, walk, that scenario. And then obviously facilitate some game demands in relation to my conditioning. So really the 2 key aspects for athlete tolerance I want to touch on was around strength. Can they control their body as we move back into return to play now? And then how efficient are they with those movements from a conditioning perspective? So can they repeatedly maintain quality movement throughout the duration of the session? So how do we apply that? We're just going to have a question now just to ponder ourselves from a planning perspective, really. How can this and does this apply to your sport individually? So whether you're a court or a field-based sport, when you look at the examples we just provided in relation to conditioning, how does this apply really to your specific environment? Because we know that what we do is going to be context specific. However, the general principles for exercise prescription and programming and our athlete tolerance model are generic across sports. So consider that as we move forward from a planning perspective. Okay, the third area we're going to touch on now is loading. So we need to put some load through the athlete. And obviously our goal as coaches is not only from a technical and tactical perspective to increase how well the player can actually play the sport, but we know that the athletes that are more resilient in relation to physical conditioning can cope with higher loads, and higher loads also come back to help with the resilience of the athlete. So some special considerations around load monitoring. So first off, we need to really look at what is the load itself, and then how do you measure that if you are measuring load. So we can do something as simple as utilizing our rating of perceived exertion, our session RPE, multiplied times by minutes of the overall session, to get a very global value for a number of arbitrary units for that particular drill or the particular training session that you've just completed. That's one way where we can start to define loadings for different drills and different sessions. And the importance around that relates specifically to, as I determine a load, so the example I've given here is for an overall session, all right, 60 minutes, as the athlete has set an RPE of 5, 300 units, and then I can align that with the actual session type itself. Secondly, it allows me, because we know that the athlete training response is individualized. So some athletes might go, wow, that particular session, I'm going to rate an 8. But if the average for the session across everybody else is a 4 or a 5, it allows us to go and open up a discussion with that athlete to see today, why were they perceiving that that session was so hard. And once again, we'll just use a modified RPE scale for that, our 1 to 10. Now, the only thing I would say about utilizing an RPE scale as such is there needs to be some education go into the athletes around the meaning of the numbers. That's the first thing. The second thing, the initial modified RPE scale or the category ratio scale itself, there are some numerical values in the initial RPE scale that do not have any descriptors. I strongly encourage to look at a descriptor for every numerical value. We need to educate the athletes on what that means. So what's different from hard to very hard? What's different from comfortable to difficult? So we need to make sure that the athletes are educated. And then, as I said, we can start to use this and link different RPEs and loads in relation to the drills that you select and use for your athletes. And we'll come back and touch on that as we get towards the end. Right. The final area I just want to touch on around the load itself is really around balance. Now you can see there are some red boxes, which will indicate obviously high load and some red flags, green, low load, and what we're trying to achieve, and then some orange. But really what we know is that low training loads obviously result in poor fitness and potentially poor performance. And low training loads will also potentially give us an increase in injury risk and increase of risk of subsequent injury. So our goal is to determine what is an adequate training load, because we know if I have an adequate training load, I can decrease injury risk and ultimately come down to good performance. It's also going to have an appropriate training load, help me increase fitness, and once again, reduce injury risk. However, what's a little bit paradoxical is there's research coming out now showing that higher loads will also help me obviously get an increase in fitness level, which can go on to good performance. However, higher loads may predispose the athlete to an increase in injury risk. So really, as we go through our injury risk in relation to load, there's a balance that we need to find around the load tolerance level for the athlete. And every athlete will be slightly different with what they can tolerate. But really for us, it's about obtaining balance. And a key to my loading is ensuring that I intersperse periods where I have adequate recovery for my athletes. We're not saying that we're taking them out of training and that we're going to focus everything on recovery. There needs to be an adaptive response to the load and to the training that we place on the athlete. But what we do know is to do that repeatedly over time, the athletes that engage in regular structured recovery activities are the athletes that have better tolerance in relation to the loading structures that we place on them. And you can use something as simple as the recovery pyramid. We talk about the 90-10 scenario. So 90% of your recovery being your big rocks, sleep, nutrition, and well-being. And then the other 10% is everything else that comes into or comes out of your recovery checklist. And we'll call those like the 1%ers that count. So what else do you have your athlete doing that's structured as part of their day in relation to recovery? Now, I really like this particular framework from Julio and his group in Spain and Belgium, where they were really looking at some key considerations for recovery. Because we know there's this interplay between short and long-term responses, pre, during, and post-training and competition sessions, and I need to intersperse recovery in there. The principle for us, though, as coaches, one of the challenges is engaging the player in the recovery process. Now, when we can do that, that's really going to help us by having some individualized prescription for recovery, as we do with exercise and technique. By having individual prescription, we're going to be able to take into consideration some of the variables you may be measuring. So some load monitoring, whether it's intensity, frequency, the areas we've just spoken about. And then have a look at the impact of other variables, such as their sleep or their nutrition or their hydration. How does that affect what they're doing on court? And are there key areas where we may need to look at some top-ups with recovery specifically? And that will be included within the monitoring that we do. Obviously, recovery is one of the key areas when we talk about injury preventions and accelerating return to play. And the key principle for that is around individualization. So knowing your roster, knowing the athlete development pathway, knowing their individual characteristics. And for us, we've used extensively the 100-point weekly recovery checklist as a good educational tool to help our athletes engage within the recovery framework as part of their training. Now, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the recovery checklist, but just from saying we've used it across multiple sports, across multiple levels and different levels of competition. So here's an example from the Commonwealth Games with Basketball Scotland with the recovery checklist. If you're unfamiliar with it, send me a tag and I can send it to you. But predominantly, we put a numerical value next to each individual recovery strategy. The recovery strategies and the numerical value have been determined on the efficacy of the strategy. So how efficacious is it? And also the level of proactiveness by the athlete to engage in the strategy. Because ultimately our goal with recovery is to have the athlete to be proactive in the implementation of recovery strategies on a day-to-day basis. And in this example, as you can see, this is our 24-hour recovery checklist, and we have a targeted number of points that we'd like the athlete to achieve. So given that specific example, I just want to reflect now on, we talk about loading a lot with our exercise prescription, with our on-court, off-court work. But my question to you, I want you to consider now is, do you plan in recovery as part of your prescription for your squad? I think usually we do a really good job with the training side of things in relation to planning our sessions, planning what we're doing on court, on field, for example. But I think the areas around recovery, we can provide some more direction on that. All right, the last area that I want to touch on now is putting it all together. The emphasis of our webinar today was really to talk to everyone around a return to play guidelines that you can practically implement to help you prepare your athletes to return to train, to transition to return to play, and then ultimately have them safely transition back to competition. So we use a 5-week plan in relation to that. So they're structured as week 1, week 2, week 3 and 4, and then obviously week 5. The size of the weeks will give you an indication of the progression in loading through those weeks as we move forward. Key to the progression model is the 50-30-20-10 rule. Now, I want you to consider that, because what we're looking at doing in relation to the 50-30-20-10 rule is, with our progression, we look at you planning your uppermost training volume for the week? What would be, if you were going back into a normal situation with that athlete and that squad, what would be your uppermost training that you would plan? Now, for week 1, we're going to look at 50% of what your uppermost planned session would be, and that would be their load for week 1. Week 2 would be 30% of that. Week 3, okay, you're now going to reduce that by 20%. Week 4, you're reducing it by 10%. So there's a gradual progressive increase in their loading. Week 1, 50% of the uppermost that you would have them do. Week 2, you would reduce it by 30%. Week 3 and 4 by 20%. Week 5 by 10%. 2 other key areas. We're looking at 5 weeks. So a 5-week lead-in to get them back into a physical capacity to cope with the competitive demands of their sport. The second thing, maximize the use of your warm-up. Gone are the days of just putting up shots or running around. Use that as a structured, dynamic warm-up. 20 minutes, include areas such as activation, balance and postural stability, some low-level or level 1 plyometric exercises, jumps on spot, single leg landings, foot intrinsic work. Take their shoes and socks off, get them to do some prehab work, some low-level change of directions that's controlled. So you can use that time more effectively as part of the warm-up as you transition into your session. All right, what does week 1 look like? As I mentioned, we're working at 50% reduction of your uppermost training volume. So in this example, it would be 2 to 3 days a week, less than 60 minutes, and intensity utilizing the RPE of around 6. The cross is for no. So no contact, no competitive work. So in week 1, we wouldn't include any of that. Plyometrics, so some eccentric loading work, level 1, 2 plyometric exercises. And once again, if you want more on that, shoot me a message and I can send you some work. There's Professor Donald Chu is the grandfather of plyometrics, and he has 6 different levels of plyometrics, which we'll touch on towards the end. And recovery points, about 8 per day out of your recovery checklist. As they then move into week 2, now we have a 30% reduction of your uppermost planned training volume for that particular week. We've increased slightly with 3 to 4 sessions a week, 60 to 75 minutes, slightly higher intensity. Now we'll start to induce low levels of contact and competitive work, along with introducing some deceleration work. Now your contact, competitive and decel work is no more, so less than about 20% of your session time. Okay, progression with their plyos to level 2 and 3, around 10 recovery points per day as they move through. Week 3 and 4, we're starting to get a bit of load in them now, 20% reduction in your uppermost planned, 4 to 6 days a week, 75 minutes, a bit more in intensity, so we're going to 8. Now I'm interplaying and have a slightly increase in my contact and competitive work, about 25% of your session time in those areas. Plyos, once again, now looking at level 3 or 4, 10 to 12 points in recovery. And then as we get into the 5th week, we're now having a 10% reduction in your uppermost planned training volume, 4 to 6 days a week, 75 minutes, 8 once again, increase slightly now my contact, competitive and decel work, about 30% of my session time spent in those areas, level 4 or 5 plyos, and then we're moving into 12 recovery points a day after those sessions. So you can see the progressive nature in relation to the 50-30-10-20-10 rule as I move forward. Some other keys in relation to the modalities. So if we're going to do some sprint work, we want to look at some acceleration speed work. All right, looking at distances for week 1, no more than 200, 20 meter increase as I go through the weeks, a 1-to-4 work rest ratio. All right, so that's total distance that we will have them do in relation to accels and change direction drills. Strength work, once again, frequency 1 to 3, weeks 1 to 3, 2 times a week, 4 to 6 exercises. Fundamental movements, look at your compound movements, push, pull, squat, lunge, and maybe 1 or 2 areas in relation to work-ons. Weeks 3 to 5, 2 to 3 days a week, 3 to 5 exercises. I'm changing now from my 3 sets of 12 to my 3 sets of 8. Plyometrics. So the issue with my plyos now is my volume or my jump loading. So I'm going from sort of 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 up to 100. Once again, a 1 to 4 work rest ratio. My level 1 work in week 1, these are my double-legged jumps in place, skipping, for example, small crisscross jumps, those sort of activities. As I go to week 2, I'm now doing some hopping work. All right, once again, now I'm looking at more stationary, not horizontal. Week 3, I'm going a bit more horizontal, looking at some jumps on landings in relation to box jumps. Week 5, I'm now starting to introduce some bounding and some drop box type landings. So once again, I have a progression in relation to my plyometric exercises. And when you think about the court sports, this is indicative of what they do. So as we go back into the competitive portion of them being competition, you know, your volume of loading in relation to your plyometric work would come up a little bit further, I would imagine. And once again, think about your recovery points checklist. Have a look at the modalities that your athletes feel comfortable doing to engage daily. But obviously the number 1 is around sleep. Number 2, so number 1 is sleep. Number 2 is mindfulness. All right, number 3 is nutrition. So let's get those things right. Psychological wellness, nutrition, hydration, sleep. Then look at your other modalities, whatever that may be. And you can refer back to the recovery checklist. But ultimately, putting that all together is, as coaches, that is the main frame and the mainstay of what we try and do. So we're going to look and finish off with 4 key areas in relation to putting it all together. Firstly, obviously, be very cognizant of your COVID-19 checklist, referring to the appropriate authorities in relation to policy guidelines, symptom checker, and hygiene protocols as you would do. Your return to training, we touched on the 50-30-20-10 rule in relation to the uppermost planned training volume. And then how we're going to have that progression over a 5-week period. Key in that is monitoring your athlete's response. Simple questionnaires on monitoring could be a smiley face, no response, sad face. How are you feeling today? How's your level of energy? How is your level of fatigue? Something simple that you can do. Focus on the physical. You need to get these athletes to build their armor. So look at your inclusions of your balance and postural stability, your integrated neuromuscular work into your warm-up. Conditioning, look at your interval training. Now, whether that moves into some maximal aerobic speed work, long, medium, short interval work. You can have some speed interplay in there. Strength work, progressing from strength endurance to maximum strength. So obviously transitioning through those characteristics. Your contacts, really focus on force absorption in relation to absorbing the force that they need to absorb under contact. Under jumps, force reduction, so the braking forces. And then obviously with your recovery, look at your checklist. And then psychologically, obviously mental health matters. So physical development is one thing, but mental well-being is the other area. Had a lot to do at the moment speaking to athletes who have been stuck in isolation with 14-day isolation periods, traveling around different places. Mental health is a major issue across the athletes that I've been speaking with at the moment. So look at mindfulness strategies specifically. And we use Smiling Mind app is a really good app to use to help them in relation to mindfulness, meditation, visualization, those sort of areas. And please continue to conduct player check-ins. All right, are you okay? And how are you coping? So make that one of the priorities that you do in relation to your reintegration back into training. So with that in mind, as far as the presentation, once again, as I said at the start, no work that we do is done independently. We collaborate with a variety of different people. So from Bevo through to Scotland, to Glasgow, to NZ, Spain, and obviously we want to acknowledge Dr. Luca and Jesse and Ernest in discussions and some material they've shared with us to put this together today. So I'll leave that there for everyone in relation to a snippet of how we go about planning our program for a return to train, return to play, return to competition, utilising a 50-30-20-10 model. And with that in mind, I'll finish off. If there's any further questions, we outline some of the principles that we use with that in our upcoming book that is coming out in publication in end of August. So you can see some of the chapters there, but we'll look at sending out a link if anyone is interested in some material in relation to the book. So with that in mind, I'll stop the sharing. I'll hand it over to Jared, and we can take some question and answers.